All right. Hey, I'm Jason, pastor at Zion. So grateful to be here with my good friend Jennifer Colby, who is our adult ministries director.
Hey, good morning, afternoon,
It's not
evening.
morning. It's not even close to morning. We actually used to do the podcast together, and we put the podcast on hiatus. Um, for those who are tuning in for the first time, I'm actually going to look at the camera because normally I'm just looking at you. But for those who are watching, the goal of this video podcast is to talk through the next 40 days that we're going through, called the 40 Days of Purpose, connected to Rick Warren's book, The Purpose Driven Life. And each week we're going to be doing kind of a video conversation around each of the purposes and kind of to get thoughts. And last week we talked about that the chief end of man, the primary purpose of all human beings is God. That is the first purpose for all humans, that all human beings were created to give glory to God. To purpose was to seek and love and know God. Mm-hmm. And then sin got in the way and messed all that up, and we tend to put ourselves at the top of that. This week, we're actually stepping into the first purpose. And the first purpose, which if it's really the second purpose, because if the first purpose is God, every other purpose after that is a byproduct.
Supports that first purpose.
Yeah, and that's so important because the very first purpose that he goes into, and I so appreciate what Pastor Rick does here, is he brings us right into the importance of worship. And on Sunday morning, the text that we used was actually from Deuteronomy, where Moses is writing to the people who are wandering in the desert. There are people who don't have a home yet. And sometimes what we miss is that God is actually preparing them for when they inhabit the land to be a people who have laws, who have a purpose themselves as a nation. And so in the book of Deuteronomy, you have kind of the social laws as well as, hey, these are the things that are just good and bad. Don't do these things, do these things. And God makes a promise to the Israelites, and he says, listen, as long as you obey the commands I give you, I'm going to bless you. You're gonna prosper. You're gonna have land. You'll have all these. You'll conquer enemies. Anybody who's a threat to you, I'll defend you. But if you break the vows, if you don't do what I asked you to, then things aren't gonna go well. That's the New Jason Standard Version. But there's this verse in there where God tells his people. He says, "Do not make." First, he says, "Remember the covenant," and then he says, "And do not take any idols. Because I am a jealous God, an all-consuming fire." And I want to start off by talking about, when we talk about worship, there is a connection between jealousy and worship. And it's hard because in our culture, jealousy is not something that it's often associated with.
It's bad.
It's a bad thing, right? Mm-hmm. When was the last time you heard jealous and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, that's good. You actually, even before we started recording, you started sharing. Share some of your thoughts on, because we were just talking about that. Literally.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hard thing about jealousy is if it's rooted in the right place, it is rooted out of love, right? Nothing, you aren't jealous of something unless there's a love connected to that. Or a liking connected to that, right? Otherwise, who cares? Yep. It's just who matter. It doesn't matter. If my husband is doing something, it's that maybe I don't have his attention, or maybe he's doing something I don't like. It's often like, if there's a jealousy connected to that, it's because I love him and I want better things for him. And so jealousy, I think at the core, is an okay thing. It's when it gets outside of love that becomes a problem.
Well, and so think of jealousy like this. Okay, so first of all, in the 10 Commandments, God doesn't say thou shalt not be jealous. He says thou shalt not covet. So coveting is wanting something that's not yours.
I'm glad you make that distinction because I do think we think that jealousy and coveting go together.
Actually, I think that's where our problem comes from, is we associate jealousy with coveting.
Right.
We actually go, well, they don't have the right to be jealous, when coveting is wanting something that's not yours. Jealousy is desiring something that should be yours. That's healthy jealousy. And so when God says this, and it's so important that, and we talked about this on Sunday, is he says, remember the covenant. Well, let's think about our wedding day. Okay, not our wedding day. We didn't get married. But when I got married to my wife, you got married to your husband, Mike. You took what?
We took vows.
You took vows. And those vows were not symbolic, they were part of a covenant. And that covenant was you promising fidelity, love, and affection to who?
Well, to my husband.
And your husband alone first.
Right.
Right? That's your first. And likewise, he took that covenant with you.
I mean, I think what's tricky is, like, just to clarify, God. Part of that covenant includes God, right?
Well,
But
so
the vows in the wedding was to my spouse.
yep, but you took a covenant before God, not to God. That's the
True,
difference.
true. And part of it is because I've already taken a covenant with God before I stepped into that
So
wedding day.
now we're coming into the root of why God gets jealous. Why does he use the language of covenant? Because covenant is not a contract. It's a promise commitment to each other, and the Jews were his covenantal people. And he's essentially, it's like a marriage contract.
Sure.
That's why
Yeah.
even as Christians, when you become a Christian, you're now part of a new covenant. We're in a committed relationship with Jesus. So the question becomes, is God jealous for the love and affection of people who are not in a covenant relationship with him? No. He's angry. That's where we see the judgment and wrath of God coming out, because he's like, hey, you should.
This should be what we have with each other.
That's right. In fact, what he would argue is, I deserve your worship. I'm worthy of your worship. And because of that, that's when you don't worship me, it's a sin. But notice he makes that's why he says, remember the covenant. The covenant is what makes jealousy okay. And so an example would be this, okay? And I've heard people say this to me. Well, there's nothing wrong with window shopping, Jason. I mean, my husband or my wife doesn't mind as long as I don't have an affair, it's okay. And my immediate mind goes to, wait a second.
That looking should only be directed to the person
right.
in the covenant.
And it's not even just the looking, it's the emotional.
Sure,
So
yeah.
one of the things we didn't talk about on Sunday is, there are two primary types of affairs that are common in culture today, okay? So the first one is a sexual affair. We're familiar with that. That's probably the most well-known. It's when there's infidelity within the marriage bed, okay? Now, I shared a story on Sunday morning about a wife and a husband who the husband was upset because his wife was jealous. And then he told me, he said, we need to meet. She's such a jealous and she's so controlling. He neglected to tell me that he'd been having an affair for years with another woman. And he's like, but that's not the point. The point is I can't stand her jealousy. Well, dude, the reason why she's jealous is because she has every right to be. That's a jealousy rooted in love. Your affection and love should only be for your covenantal spouse. Now, let's take that a step back, okay? So when you think about God's longing for your love, and it sounds in our culture selfish. Like, because if I were to go to...
Like, I deserve to be loved by you, kind of thing.
Like,
yeah.
okay, so let's picture, do you guys, it's like a rock star standing on stage and
Sure.
everybody love me, right? And
It's very it's a self-serving or like a selfish kind of attention, if you will.
and that's super icky.
Yes.
Like
That actually is off-putting. Like, no, I don't actually want to love you if you're like that.
yeah, and so when we see that and we're like, well, and God's demanding that, because we look at that and we go, that person's insecure. And here's, I think, part of the problem why jealousy and worship go hand in hand is the reason why God is worthy of your love, absolute love first, is because first, he is truly worthy of it. When you think about, okay, so let's think about your children, for example. If I were to come to them and say, hey, you need to call me dad, you'd say, absolutely not. Jason is not your father.
And Jason cannot come to our house anymore.
No, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And you would actually say, if I were to come in and tell them what to do, you'd be like, no, Jason's not your dad. Okay? Well, if God is truly the creator of the universe, if everything derives before him and he has eternally existed, meaning nothing created him, and he is God, it's not insecure of him to demand worship, because that's what makes him God. He is ultimately supreme in all things. That's the definition of God.
Of God, right?
Right? And so we look at other religions, and other religions will say things like, well, I'll use Mormonism, and I want to be careful. The goal is not to bash Mormonism, but I will say I disagree with Mormons on this. They'll say that God, as we worship him, was once a man on another planet. In fact, I think it's the Journal of Discourses says, as man now is, God once was, as God now is, man will become. And so in their mind, something created God.
Sure.
Well, then that thing is what? God. So I want to talk a little bit today, and I want to hear your thoughts on, when you think about the importance of worship, we're so quick to think about music, because that's mostly where we go to, or the 20 to 25 minutes on a Sunday morning. But when you think about worship, Jennifer, how are the ways that you connect with God, that you are saying, God, you're worthy of my worship? What are the things about God that you go, man, he's so worthy? I'd love to hear that.
I think one of the things for me is just his kindness. Like when you know the specific individual love that the Father has specifically for you and meets you and shows you in specific way. It's similar to my kids. I show them love in different ways, right?
Yeah.
Because they receive love in different ways and they like to be shown love in different ways. And so I think for me um when I see the Father love Jennifer Colby the way that Jennifer Colby needs to be loved, that is so it's just as a reminder of like how awesome he is
Yeah.
and how kind he is. And that to me is like he's worth the worship because not because he loves me, but because he is love. You
Yeah.
know?
And I think that's what's so important about that is so often when we think about worship, at the center of most of our worship is what I think worship is, instead of what God wants. Have you ever done the 5 love languages? We actually talked about this in the message on Sunday. Do you know your love languages?
Yes.
So do you want to share them? If you don't,
Sure.
it's okay. Okay.
Words of affirmation.
Okay.
And acts of service. But I'll tell you that acts of service isn't what I've found for me is it's not like, oh, you did the dishes, I love you. Like that really makes me feel loved. It's when you don't do something that I feel unseen or unheard
Oh,
or
yeah.
unloved in that way. So that's how I came to know that that one was a love language for me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, and no one's going to look at you and go, oh, that's so needy. No, you're wired with a love language. Mine is touch. Touch is my primary love language. And then I actually discovered gifts. I used to think, oh, I don't really care about gifts. No, I don't care about a gift if it's not,
Meaningless or like a
Yeah.
thoughtless.
like if someone's really thought about something and been like, man, Jason would really like this. I'm like, oh my gosh, that means so much. And here's the part: if we're made in the image of God and God created us with love language, God has love languages. And part of the love language, and this is the difference, is that we don't have to guess what God's love language is. He tells us his love language is. And it's the things that give him pleasure. This is part of what I really liked.
You are playing for God's pleasure.
Yeah, and like, okay, so when Lisa does something to bless me, to speak my love language, she's doing it to bring me pleasure.
There's an intentionality to show you love.
Yes, and in fact, that's how I know she loves me, is she's being thoughtful of what gives me pleasure, not just herself, right?
Right.
And likewise, and this is a healthy relationship, is that I want to give her pleasure. I want to meet her in her gifts, right?
Yeah.
And if God has a love language, and first, I think sometimes we forget God's primary love language is worship, that when we exalt him and say his name above everything else, that's the first love language. But then he also says, if you love me, you'll obey my commands. And I think this is where a lot of times we forget that to obey God's commands is not just being a good person. It's the things that God has called us to.
Sure.
I know you're passionate about dispatch and the stuff that's going on there. And you've been doing dispatch within police station here for years. How long have you been involved in that?
20 years.
20 years, okay.
Yeah.
When you're there, when you're operating in that, when God is at the forefront, do you see it as an act of worship, and why?
Absolutely. Because I feel like it's that I'm living in the way that he created me to live.
Yeah.
And that's glorifying to him when it's like, these are the specific skill sets, the specific giftings,
Yeah.
the specific passions. When you put all those together, I think that does glorify God.
Yeah, and here's the part. I think sometimes we think the commands of God are burdensome, and Jesus said, my commands are
Easy
easy
light.
and light.
Yeah.
And we think them all about the law. We're thinking like, don't lust, don't murder, don't
All the
kill.
don'ts.
And
Yeah.
all the things. And when in reality, when we're living into the fullness of our purpose, God actually gets delight in that because we're obeying the command of saying, no, this is what I was purposed for, right? There are other aspects that I think are so hard for us to understand because we've got a disconnection between the Old Testament and the New Testament of the people of God. There's a prophet named Amos. And at this point in Israel's history, they were very selfish. In fact, remember, they were people who were slaves who were rescued out of slavery. And now the people who were rescued from slaves are now the slave owners. And they've got Jews who are enslaved to other Jews. And they've stopped caring for the widow. They've stopped caring for the fatherless and the oppressed.
They forgot what it was like to be a slave.
That's right. And this is why God throughout the Old Testament consistently says, remember when you were in slavery to Egypt and I rescued you, right? And the prophet Amos comes in and this is a loose paraphrase from the message. He comes in and he says, your worship makes me sick. I can't stand your electric guitars. I can't stand your choruses and your organ music because you've forgotten to do the things I care about. And in that, what that shows us is that worship is not about an experience, and it's not even an expression of music. It's doing the things that delight God.
Yeah.
And Amos reminds us that God cares about justice just as much as he cares about fulfillment of your purpose. When you think about the idea of, is Jesus worth following? Because the two questions that I asked that we talked about on the sermon is, first, we believe God is worthy of our worship because he's God. But he's also worth our worship. And the reason why he's worth something is because the cost, in fact, I don't think we could ever fully equate the cost of how good God is. When you think about what makes God worth it for you, what is it about who God is and how he's operating in your life? What makes loving and following Jesus worth it for you?
That's a great question. I don't know if I know the answer.
It's okay.
But I think, well,
we
I
don't
thi-
script these, by the way.
no, yeah. And I'm just, because following Jesus is hard.
Yeah.
There's a radical ask and like he asks some radical obedient things of radical obedience sometimes.
Yeah.
And there's suffering and there's hardships
Yeah.
and there's frustrations. And like, sometimes I think the harder you follow Jesus, the harder it is to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
And so what makes that worth it? What makes it if you step into a covenantal relationship with the Lord and it gets worse for you here on earth?
Yeah.
And I think the only thing for me is it's still better than when it was without him.
Yeah.
And that's the only way I can, that I could say that that's how I know that it's worth it, because take away everything, strip away everything from my life, throw in every hardship or suffering that humanity could possibly experience, and the love and the presence of the Lord and the forgiveness of the Lord
Yeah.
covers it all.
Well, and I wonder how much of this also has to do with, because we're eternal creatures. And I'm just thinking about this as we're talking, is I think part of what makes God worth it is because this world isn't it.
This isn't
This isn't it.
all of the story.
And so even when it says our light and momentary troubles, there's still acknowledgement of troubles, and they feel so heavy in the moment. But in comparison for eternity, if God is who he says he is, and this goes back to the worthiness of God,
Yeah.
he's worthy of being worshiped. But what makes him worth it is that because he is eternal and he created us with eternity in our hearts, because we're meant for something else outside of this, when we actually give worship here, when we give our lives in worship to here, we trust that God actually, and I've had people argue with me on this, God rewards that. And we've been taught, and this is part, I think, one of the challenges for Christians, is we've been taught, well, that's selfish. You're only following God for the reward. And that's the problem is Scripture actually tells us that there is a reward in heaven. And so, no, I don't think there's anything wrong in saying, well, no, I'm honoring God because I do trust in the reward. But the ultimate reward is
God
it's
himself.
Jesus, it's God,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I think that's what that people don't understand who aren't Christian or who haven't submitted their life to Christ is our greatest reward, the greatest worth for you and me is Jesus himself. And as hard as this world is and when you look at the people who in Jesus' circle, only one of them didn't die from being murdered.
Right.
Every other one was murdered, and the other one they tried to murder him, and he, by the grace of God, survived, and that's John, who ended up being exiled on an island and wrote the book of Revelation, right? Everyone else, they were killed. And you could go, well, was that really worth it? And I want to bring
It
us.
wasn't to them, otherwise they could have recanted.
That's actually one of the number one proofs that if you want to
Jesus
say, how can we know for sure that Jesus was who he said he was, is that worshiping him, giving worship to Jesus was worth it in their lives because they were willing to lay down their lives. And why would you do that for a lie, for something that wasn't worth it? I want to read a story from the Gospel of Mark, and it's a very small one, and we've heard it many times. It says this is Mark 1. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. They had a family business, and that's where they made their money. Now, we need to be careful. It's not like they were hand over fist rich. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they had boats. They had provision. Sea of Galilee was a bountiful place for fishing. As Jesus was walking by, he said, "Come, follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people." At once, They left their nets and followed him. Now, here's what I think when we read the Gospels, we make it sound like it's like Jesus just appeared and they were like, I need to, I'm going to follow.
I gotta go.
All right. And here's the thing. These people actually probably knew who Jesus was. They'd probably met Jesus. They'd heard about Jesus because in the Gospel of John, we have Jesus' baptism.
Sure.
Matthew and John talks about the baptism of Jesus. There was something about Jesus that was worth giving up everything. They dropped their nets. There was a cost to their worship. And I think that's the challenge that we come into is I don't think we associate worship with a cost, but anything we worship comes with a cost. And for them, they said, hey, Jesus is worth the cost. They probably made their father very angry. The father was depending on them to take over the family business, right?
Yeah.
And that in itself, I think, asks people like, well, that seems unreasonable of Jesus. Well, Jesus himself said, listen, I'm going to make enemies in households. Some of you are going to want to follow me and your family's not going to understand. When I look at my life, and if you have any, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. What makes Jesus worth it to me, following Jesus, not just worthy because he is worthy, but what makes it worth it, Jesus gave me a new identity.
Yeah.
And in that identity, I have found purpose and meaning in my life, but I've also found strength that I could never have found within myself. And I love in 1 John when it says God is love. And everything that God does, there's a phrase that's used over and over again in the Old Testament. His love endures forever. Actually, it begins with give thanks to the Lord, for he is good and his love endures forever. For me, that's the part where I know that even in the parts that I don't understand, this is how I can worship God when things aren't going the way I want them to, is because I know his love endures forever. His love, he is love. He is not just loving, he is the embodiment of love. And while I may not understand it right now, when I sacrifice my praise, that's why it's called the sacrifice of praise, when you give praise when it's hard, when it costs more than it feels like you can afford. There's something beautiful in that. When you look at the direction of the things that God has done in your life over the last several years, are there things that you look at and go, God, I didn't know the cost then. I didn't really understand the cost, but I do now. And thank you because it was worth it. Does that question make sense?
I think so. It's going to be kind of a weird answer, I think, but I think just the cost of working in vocational ministry.
Yeah.
There's a cost that people outside who don't work in the church don't understand.
Yeah.
And it costs your family.
Yeah.
It costs what you can offer them. And I know I've had lots of conversations with people on staff where it's like, I'm just trusting the Lord with my family.
Yeah.
So I think that would be the thing for me that I would say, but to go through the years of it, it's like, yes, but
Yeah.
because he is still worth it.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful that the Lord has me in a place in my faith where I can say, yeah, it was hard. There was sacrifice, and he is worth every sacrifice that I can offer him.
Yeah.
And he is pleased with that.
Yeah. There's a fruitfulness.
Yeah.
When you
it's not wasted. There's growth and beauty.
And I think that's the part that I think I've talked to so many people who don't see the fruit of their worship. That when you give God worship, even when you don't feel like it. One of the things I love that Rick Warren said in the book is, God wants to be your friend, and friends demand honesty. And there is something holy when we worship God in our honesty. And I think so many Christians are afraid to worship God honestly. To say, God, I'm kind of angry at you right now. God's got enough to handle your anger. God, I'm not sure about this right now. God, I don't know if I can afford this. It brings, I think about, and I think you preached on this last few months ago, the woman who came and anointed Jesus' feet. Yeah. And everybody was like, that's too costly. That is not much. Worth it. That's too much.
You look at all the good things you could do with that.
Yeah, and we see that all the time. And I think that's the power of when worship becomes our purpose. If we know that the purpose is the Lord, there's nothing there's never a cost too much if Jesus is at the center.
If it's done in the right posture. Yeah.
That's
I
right.
think, even in that story, what does Jesus say? You have done the best
You've
thing.
done the right thing, the
You've done
best
the
thing.
right best thing.
Yeah.
And just that honor and that reminder of saying to that daughter of God, like, your worship and your heart is in the right place.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I think is hard is sometimes we assume what God wants in our worship. And I've seen this. You brought up the ministry thing, and I've been in professional ministry now for 23 years. Jeez Louise, 23 years.
High five.
That's almost half my life. That's over half my, no, almost half my life.
And thank you. Thank you. Because I know the sacrifices that
No,
you've had to make.
thank you. I do appreciate that. I think sometimes, and this is the hard part in church, and I'm going to get real here. Some churches actually demand sacrifices that the Lord didn't. And I think that's when churches get unhealthy. I think that's when Christians get unhealthy, is when they've added man's rules onto things and then called it godly. I heard a pastor, and I was really, really frustrated by this, but I heard a pastor who was speaking at a wife's conference for husbands who were missionaries. And so it's for the wives, their husbands are on the mission field. And this pastor, very well-known pastor, I'm not going to say his name, very well-known pastor said, wives, you and your children need to suck it up. Because what he's doing is holy. You should consider it an honor that you don't get to see your dad, that your husband's not around, because he's doing the work of the Lord. And I went, I think the Apostle Paul had something to say about that when he said it's better not to be married if you want to do ministry, because my first ministry is my wife and my family. And when churches or when Christians put unhealthy expectations saying, well, now that's worship, it needs to be worth it, I don't think that's what God calls us to. Now, there might be circumstances. We hear about missionaries who are martyred for their faith. But I think they had a clear call in their life and their spouses were in agreement. And often it was a husband and wife together on the mission field. And I can't help but wonder if part of the reason why some people are so nervous about the worship of God is that they actually don't know God's heart in worship. That they actually think God's heart is it's selfishness and cruel, and not actually when we delight in God, when God becomes the object of our worship, we actually get more out of it than we ever realize. He gets the most we can give through our worship. But he is so loving and good that he blesses us in return, and what pleases God begins to please us. As we end this, and I think the idea that we're created with worship in mind. How do you connect with God in worship? He again, he talked about in the book that there are different types of personalities. We don't all worship the same. We have the same God we worship, but we're all created different. What are some ways that you worship? What connects with you?
Walking.
Okay.
When I'm moving my body, I find that I can connect with the Lord.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because what do we say often is in the church, like, we got to be still.
Be still and know that it's kind of not the
sit
point
in
of
your
the verse.
closet,
Psalm 46.
And so, yeah. But for me, when I am in creation and see his greatest creation, human beings walking past me, there's something that allows me to connect with him. And you asked about worship, but I guess I'm talking kind of where I feel like I can connect.
No, that is worship. That is connecting. That's exactly it.
Yeah.
They're the same thing. Yeah.
And I think the other thing is when I am, honestly, when I'm ministering to people individually,
Okay.
and whether it's my children or whether it's a friend or, something like that. But in those moments, I feel like that is actually that I've brought the Lord like into that, and he, like, I don't know how to describe it, but just this idea that, like, we're a team doing that, you know? And I think that worships and glorifies him.
I would agree. One of my really good friend of mine said, Jason, I feel most alive when I'm doing what he called me to do the most. I've always loved music. Music has spoken to me for years. And so the music side of worship has always been important to me. A lot like you. Nature is one of the ways that I connect with the Lord. Mine's, I think, very similar. When I'm preaching God's word, when I'm helping direct people, I feel, and I think it's similar, I'm doing what God has called me to do for his glory, for the benefit of somebody else to encounter God.
Yeah.
And I do believe that gives worth and worthiness to God when I do that, because I'm not the center of that. This
Yeah.
is not, this is what Jason has to offer. No, here's what the Lord has to offer, and I'm simply pointing you to God.
Yeah.
I love when Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. And I think if I could give any encouragement to people that are listening or watching, we have to break out of the molds that says that worship only happens one way on a Sunday morning, singing a song, raising your hands. For some people, that's great. But there are all kinds of different. Some people are intellects. Like
Like cooking is
cooking.
like a way some people really experience the
Yeah.
Lord.
And if you can discover how God has wired you, I think that will help you get to your purpose, because you'll start going, oh wait, when I do that for the Lord, then maybe that's why God created me. Like I wonder if there are people that God purposed them in the world to create beautiful meals for his glory. Like that's their purpose.
Yeah.
And then he calls them to situations to leverage that purpose. How cool would that be? So I don't know if Gordon Ramsay's a Christian or not, but if he was,
He does have Hell's Kitchen.
yeah.
I don't know if we can judge by that.
But that, I mean, what an amazing way to look at it, going, what if the thing that I'm passionate about actually is pointing
Yeah.
to my purpose, and I just have to redirect it back to God?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think one other thing on that is that we need to not compare with one another
Yes.
how we are worshiping the Lord.
Oh, yeah.
And I think sometimes we think, well, okay, well, that's what, Jason's doing, so that's what I need to be
That's
doing.
what I have
And
to
there
do.
is some wisdom in that. There's some wisdom in going, hey, maybe I should try this to see if that works for me. But and I don't want to say works for me because this isn't about us, right? But it's just how we feel alive, which is when we are living in our identity as, sons and daughters of the King, and we are doing the thing he's created us to do. That is the most worshipful thing that we can offer.
Well, and I'll end with this. I think it's a direct connection. Okay, so let's go back to the love languages. So, touch is not my wife's primary love language, but it is one of hers. Well, when I'm using my love language and it's connecting with her love language at the same time, we get synergy.
Sure.
And I think there are things that God calls us to do, not because we like them, but because he does. And so the challenge I'll give, and I had to do this for me, for someone who doesn't like singing, God delights in your singing. Well, Jason, I have a horrible voice. It's called a joyful noise, not a joyful melody. And so God says, I want you to sing. So you sing because God has asked you to. It's about his pleasure. On the flip side, because I love singing, the Lord has told me he loves silence. And so there are Sundays where I feel like the most worshipful thing I can do is to silence myself and just listen and be present with the Lord.
Yeah.
And that is what's called the sacrifice of praise. It's doing something that is not natural. Sacrificing is not natural. And so there are things that he calls us to. Loving my neighbor, not always easy. It's a sacrifice.
And not natural.
It's certainly not natural, right? Well, this has been so good. And you kind of stepped in last minute, and I really appreciate you stepping in. And this is, I'm excited for this. I think the next several weeks, we're going to have some wonderful conversations, and hopefully we'll have you back on again. And we're going to be trying some different formats. And our goal is, this is kind of prepping us, and we're going to start taking data and collecting it over the summer and looking at relaunching possibly in the fall if we're seeing the fruit and if this is an area God wants to move. Thank you so much for being with me, Jennifer. I appreciate it.
Hey, let's remember the covenant.
Yeah.